Hello and welcome to this episode of Our Longevity Futures. I'm your host, Chris Cohen, and today I'm delighted to speak to Dr. Emil Kendziorra. As well as being a medical doctor, Emil is an entrepreneur and the founder and the CEO of Tomorrow Biostasis, a company based in Berlin that offers full body cryopreservation. So thank you so much for joining me, Emil. This has honestly been one of the interviews that I've been really looking forward to. So yeah, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for the invite and great to have me. Thanks a lot.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do at Tomorrow Biostasis?
Right. Yeah. So as you briefly said, practically speaking, we're a cryopreservation company, right? So this fundamental idea that should you be diagnosed with any disease that is currently not curable, right? Old age included, medical science might not have progressed fast enough, and then once you're now legally pronounced dead, you're being cryopreserved, right? With this specialized procedure, which is sometimes always called freezing, which of course it isn't, and we're quite adamant that it isn't, and actually a lot of stuff that we do to not freeze anything. But of course, colloquially or the picture is always you being frozen, right? But okay, now you're cryopreserved, and then basically we wait until medical technology has advanced enough to, well, first of all, cure the underlying disease that led to your death in the first place, and then secondarily, of course, once it's possible to revive you, we would do that. And as you mentioned, I'm running an organization which does that from an operation standpoint, and I'm running a non-profit foundation in Switzerland that does research for that topic. Yeah, these are the two main things I think we do.
Well, it's such an interesting sort of area. It's you must have heard this a million times, but it's so much out of almost science fiction. So how did you actually get into this sort of area, and how did your interest take off in it?
Yeah, so originally I actually come from the longevity and life extension space. So I studied medicine because back in the day when I was 17 or 18 or whatever. My original plan was to join Aubrey, right, and do build a company in the sense space or somewhere in that range, and then I studied medicine, went into cancer research after that, then got a bit disillusioned by academic research in Germany.
Can't be blamed for that.
Yeah, I think that's probably true for most countries where academic research is great and all, but if you want to be a bit more tangible, it might not be the best place to be. And then I've been building tech companies over the last years. Not necessarily because I'm super excited to build tech companies, but this whole field unfortunately is relatively expensive and at least historically underfunded. So I thought it's a good idea to have some war chest on my own, but always with the idea of going back into that space, right? And then in 2018, I decided that now is the time to actually do that, or start thinking about it. And then I looked at the longevity and life extension space and what's going on there and so on. And I think maybe one of the main disagreements that I have with the longevity and life extension people, not necessarily about that this makes sense in principle, it's just about the time frame, right? So I much rather in 20 years going around to all the other people and will tell them, hey guys, I'm sorry, I was always the pessimist, right? You guys are right now, I can just take the pill and I live longer, right? Figuratively speaking. I'd much rather do that than, be old at 85 and there is no longevity and life extension technology around. And then, well, that's it, right? So based on that, I decided to go into this biostasis or cryopreservation field, right? Hoping that I will never use it or never need to use it, but assuming that will not be the case and that I will need to use it. So that's a short. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, when was the sort of first moment you thought, okay, this is going to be the idea of the company that I take forward, Cryogenics and Cryonics? When was that sort of initial moment?
Yeah. So that was somewhere in 2018. So initially, I've been signed up for a cryopreservation contract as a backup solution for many years, right? But so this was not the original plan to go into that space. The original plan was to say, hey, I'm building a company or a research institute or whatever, to develop, anti-aging medicine, right, or longevity drugs or treatments or whatever it is, right? The only thing is, so I come from cancer research, right? And cancer research every 10 years, practically speaking, they say, in 10 years, we're going to have that cancer drug, right? Mm-hmm. And last time in 2005, right, when the NCI, it's not random people, it's the National Cancer Institute in the US, which is part of the NIH, said, 2015, we want to get gotten rid of cancer. Now, in looking at that space, it's usually, unfortunately, usually things take a bit longer than you think they do. And looking at the longevity space, back then, I didn't feel like there's a high probability that this will be around when I'm old. And based on that, I decided, okay, so I'd rather go for what people sometimes call Plan B, or which doesn't need to be Plan B. Like these two solutions can work together quite well. But I'd rather spend my time on something that is tangibly available should I need it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating story and a really, really interesting area. And I think I want to sort of start to delve into the actual biology of it and the technical sides of it. So how do you actually go about cryopreserving someone after they've died?
Right. Yeah. So maybe starting from that point, right? So at the time when the heart stops, right, the degradation processes start, right? So heart stops, but the oxygen is not being not circulated to the body anymore.
So literally immediately after death.
Yeah. So practically speaking, right, brain cells and all the other cells need oxygen to survive, right? So when the heart stops, oxygen is not being provided to the cells, right? Mm-hmm. So at that point, cells at some point, I mean, it's not a flip switch, right? So there's still oxygen in the blood. There's still the cells. It's not one or nothing. But at some point after that, the cells start active and passive degradation processes. So what you want to do is first stop these processes, right? And in medicine, there's the saying which says, you're only dead when you're warm and dead, right? It's a saying where when people are clinically dead at low temperatures and you don't try to resuscitate them, it's malpractice, right? Because what happens if you reduce the temperature, the metabolic activity on the cell level goes down, and since the metabolic activity goes down, the oxygen consumption goes down. So these degradation processes that are partly energy dependent. So it's not like a passive dying process; it's more an active recycling process. So I mean, it's complex in detail, of course, but on a high level. And now by cooling, you stop these processes. And so the first thing you want to do is cool as quick as possible. And how do you actually go about doing that? Right, so it's multiple steps. So you want to cool, and initially you just cool with ice water. So, or more precisely, a combination with external cooling, which is literally ice water, which is being circulated and so on. And the other side, you want to do internal cooling.
I believe we might have lost Dr. Emil there. Hopefully his picture comes back on soon. Dr. Emil, if you can hear me, I can't actually hear you at the moment. Your picture is just frozen. There we go. Hopefully he'll come back soon.
Hi, I can see you.
There we go.
Now back.
Can you see me?
Pressure on me somehow. Yeah,
there we go. I can hear you and see you now. Okay, that's great. Yeah, I think we might have lost you for a second, but
yes, it might be. So what was I saying? Yeah, how do you do cooling, right? So you do external cooling and you do internal cooling. And internal cooling is basically just being done with a heart lung machine, which practically circulates the cold fluid through your circulatory system, which of course, since the circulatory system is has much more surface area, cooling is much quicker. This is not a procedure that is novel to this topic. It's being done in heart surgery, right? So it's not something super unique, right? Now you cool further down with these two cooling methods. And of course, now what you do not want to do, you don't want to go under 0 degrees, because the body, of course, is largely water. And if you freeze water, it forms ice crystals. And just very physically, ice crystals are sharp, right? They have sharp edges, and they would destroy the cellular structure. Now, what you want to do, you want to avoid creating these ice crystals. You want to cool fast, but without ice. That's why I'm saying it's not freezing by any means, because most of what we do is to avoid just that freezing. So what you do now, since you've been already circulating cold fluids, what you start circulating now is a cryoprotective agent, which is practically speaking a medical antifreeze, which is a solution that does multiple things. It draws water out of the tissue, so it has high osmolarity, so high basically concentration. It draws water out of the tissue. So the water is already gone and it's then being taken out of the body. And it has a multitude of different things in there that stop ice crystal formation by so-called ice blockers, by just replacing basically the water against other solutions that do not freeze and so on. And once you've done that, you want to cool down further, and then ultimately to, somewhere between what's called the glass transition temperature. And this is what we're actually doing. As opposed to freezing, it's called vitrification. It's basically transferring or putting the tissue into an amorphous state, which is called a vitrified state, which is super cooled but not frozen. And at that temperature, then no further metabolic processes go on, no further degradation processes go on, and so on and so on. So at that temperature and in that state, you can then practically maintain the body, practically speaking, indefinitely. And that's what in a nutshell, the procedure is about.
So going back to the actual sort of point of death, I mean, in different parts of the world, people are declared dead for different reasons. For example, some places people are declared dead when their heart function ceases, or whilst their brain function ceases. So how does this actually affect your procedure? And I suppose we'll come on to the next question, but how does that actually affect the procedure there?
Yeah, so very importantly, so legally, we can only start when the person, based on the local laws, has been legally pronounced dead. Right? So this is not a medical procedure that is there to cure, whatever the underlying disease is. So we figuratively speaking, we can't touch the patient until they're being pronounced dead. Now, then we start. And as you just mentioned, different countries have different regulations of how death can be pronounced, right? So some countries do it based on circulatory arrest, or heart stopping, right? Some countries do it based on brain death, or there's also, of course, combinations. And then there are countries where, you can do it based on brain death, but you can't do it based on circulatory arrest, but you can, for example, do it on, there's a list of so-called secure or clear death signs, like these deep colorations on the skin and so on and so on. Now, based on which country one of our patients is in, we always need to wait on that, and then we get started, right? And of course, for us, the important factor is that we start cool down as quick as possible after circulatory rest, but legally speaking, always only after legal death, after pronouncement of death. Yeah.
And so you mentioned before that 80%, almost 80% of our body is made up of water, and you actually you draw the water out using this process of vitrification. I'm wondering how much of the water does actually get drawn out? And
Yeah.
how do the cells and the tissues and the organs actually survive this process of when you do cool the body down to such low temperatures, if there is still some water remaining in there?
Yeah. So I mean, from an understanding of today, right? They don't survive, right? Right? Because I mean, what do you mean by survive? There's no metabolic activity going on anymore, right? So practically speaking, I wouldn't call that necessarily the cells survive. They're being kept in a state where the structure of the cells, the connectome of different cells, right, and the cellular structure is being kept in a state where we would argue that, you know, with future technology, they would be able to then revive and resuscitate it and then live again, right? So of course, yeah. So funny enough, so dehydration of the tissue currently is a quality metric. So more dehydration is better, means less ice, right? So yes, you want to, I mean, you don't take out 100% of the water, of course, right? But, and you don't need to, because you can also, if you increase the concentration of the cryoprotective agent, there might be a water molecule, you know, here and there, but all in all, it's not an amount that then freezes and forms ice crystals by any relevant to any relevant amount. And of course, it's very important to note, this is still active research, right? So this is not something where I would say, yeah, you know, it's 100% quality, everything is great and everything is figured out. Far from that. There's still a lot of research to be done to make this, you know, a procedure that I would, you know, that.
Well, I think that attests to almost the whole of science, isn't it? I don't think any procedure is 100% accurate or.
No, absolutely not. But I would argue there are probably some procedures that are better understood and where we could say, you know, this is already pretty close to, we're pretty close. This, I would argue, is a bit further away still. But then again, you know, I mean, as I said, that we're not advising this at all as an elective procedure, right? So this is arguably the last ditch effort, right? If all other methods of living or living longer have failed, then this comes as a last resort. Yeah.
And how did we actually arrive at the current protocols and methods? You said that some of it's very similar to what they do in heart surgery, but obviously it does deviate from other sort of more orthodox procedures quite a bit.
Yeah.
So how did we actually arrive at these protocols?
Yeah, so cryopreservation in itself is not necessarily a novel concept, right? So if anybody has worked in a lab, in a biomedical research lab, right? I mean, you cryopreserve your cells all the time, right? Sperm and egg cells are preserved all the time in cryopreservation. It's the same fundamental procedure, right? They're being vitrified. You can vitrify, you know, parts of a body for transplantation. For example, aortic valves and different parts of cartilage, right? So fundamentally, this process is not even a new process. It's a very old process, right? So of course, some of the knowledge comes from there, and then there's more and more research, or has been done over the last, you know, decades, to cryopreserve organs, right? So there's a big organ shortage, right? Where people need organ transplants, but there are no organ transplants close by. And since what we currently do in organ transplantation is you basically transport the organ on ice, on just ice cubes, practically speaking. And of course, since the temperature is not really low, and you know there is still metabolic activity going on in the heart, for example, you only have so much time until the heart needs to be transplanted, right? So there's a lot of research, and it makes a lot of sense to store organs for longer periods of time when someone dies, and then until someone needs it, who is a match. And so there's research from organ transplantation that goes into this field. There's fundamental research from cryopreservation, cryopreserving small model animals, or model organisms more precisely. So there's a lot of research from cryobiology. And then on the other hand, the more procedural stuff, the operation and so on, that is very similar to perfusion. Like, you know, standard perfusion that is done during heart surgery, for example. And taking these two parts together, this is practically what we're doing, right? Like the operative parts from medical procedures, and then the research side from cryobiology. Yeah.
So you mentioned other sort of model organisms that had been frozen and then been revived.
Right.
So obviously you said it was cells as well, and they're obviously very simple, a cell's a cell.
Yeah.
Multicellular organisms are much more complex. Like you said, you have different organs, different tissues, all working together. What is almost the most sort of complex organism that is actually being frozen and brought back? Like, what are some of those organisms that we have actually done it successfully with?
Right. So for a whole organism, it's C. elegans, right?
Okay.
That's why I'm saying organism, right? I mean, of course, you can call it an animal, but animal implies dog or cat, right? And of course, that's far away from it. So from the most complex organ is a kidney. So kidneys have been cryopreserved and then being retransplanted in, for example, rabbits, and they work after retransplantation, right? So on an organ level, in the end, cryopreserving tissue or organs or animals or humans, what works and what doesn't work is mostly a function of size. Like just physical size makes it significantly more complex to cryopreserve larger organs. You don't have that much. You don't get the cryoprotective agent everywhere. Just thinking of physics, cooling down larger volumes is very difficult, right? That is why cells work so well. Basically, cells, you can just throw them in liquid nitrogen with cryoprotective agent and they're fine, right? Because the cryoprotective agent perfuses into the cell and they're being cooled down super quickly. So that's I mean,
so
if
it
you're working on that,
it really is a question of physics and time, essentially.
Almost, right? I mean, it's also there of course are some complexities. For example, in humans, of course, the brain is protected by what is called the blood-brain barrier, right? Which is basically a lining of the vessels that protects the brain from easily being infected by whatever bacteria that is in the bloodstream that is not supposed to go into the brain. So in cryopreservation, that blood-brain barrier keeps the cryoprotective agent out. So there are some specifics, of course, but in general, it's a function of size.
And have we actually ever tried to revive a human from this state of cryopreservation? Has that ever been attempted or not yet?
No. And rightfully so, because it's not, it might work, it might not work. The answer is no, it might not work. Or the answer is no, it will not work by 100% probability, right? Or well, close to that. So from a revival part, this whole topic is from cryopreservation, bringing back a whole human or even a whole animal. A good part is almost still on a conceptual side there. So my estimation is definitely not that this will work in 10 or 20 or 30 years. This is way further down the line, right? It's not thousands of years down the line, but significant. Yeah.
So what are the key areas that we do actually need to focus on for that to become a reality? Is there things that fields that we're at the beginning of now that you feel like, oh yeah, actually give that 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we'll be there? What are those key sort of areas?
Yeah, so we will initially only focus on improving the quality of a cryopreservation, and we will not put research money or research resources into revival, right? Because this is far away, right? You would just basically throw your money away. In general, the research that needs to be done for reviving someone, you have a few conceptual problems where you really need to figure out novel of how to do something in principle, and then you have a long list of devil in the detail problems, right, that you need to figure out. So it starts with when you bring so now you have cryopreserved someone, and the temperature of cryopreservation is either -196 or somewhere in the range of -140. Both have advantages and disadvantages, but that's kind of a ballpark. So if you now start to increase the temperature from that point, then you start having ice crystallization again, right? Because there's still probably some water molecules here and there. So if you increase the temperature, these ice crystals would go to a temperature where they would start to basically nucleate, which means basically an ice crystal starting on a point, and then the ice crystal is forming around that point or growing around that point. Now, you could avoid that if you would do the warming process really, really fast. But no one has an idea how to do it really, really fast without, burning the outer layers, basically, right? Figuratively speaking. So this is one detail, right? Then cryoprotective agents at higher temperatures are toxic. So when you go up, you generate toxicity, right? And so some of them are more fundamental, how to get rid of the cryoprotective agent, how to do warming, and then toxicity, for example, would be a detailed problem. I mean, when I say detail, it's not really details, right? It's relatively large details. So, in predicting science, of course, over decades, I feel like this is pure speculation, right? So there's no way for me or anybody for that matters to say, I'm pretty confident that this will work in X years or whatever, right? So my point is, if something is possible in principle, then I feel like if the value proposition is good, it's worth working on that. But revival here will take time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it's almost I want to say it's almost inevitable. In some point in the future, there will be the technology there. You really hope so.
Yeah.
That's what your whole business is based on. And really, there's like you said, it's. Why not? Why not? Because it gives you that sort of extra chance. And I guess
absolutely. And as long as we can assume that we have a relatively acceptable understanding where memories and consciousness and so on comes from. And of course, I'm not super religious, and pretty sure most of the people here on this call are not super religious either. Well, then that stuff comes from the structure in your brain. Right? As long as you keep that structure around with high fidelity, then fundamentally, well, it's just a matter of time until you can, fix that structure and then, resuscitate it.
Now, I'm sure you've talked to lots of people who are skeptical about your vision and your company's sort of goals. What do you usually say to those sort of people?
So it depends on what the criticism is, right? So of course, we definitely don't want to convert anybody to become a believer, right? So by no means do I feel like this is something where people, there's an argument to be made where people say, hey, this is just not for me, right? Same as there will be people, if you just need to take the pill and you live significantly longer than you currently can, there will be people who will be like, no, this is not for me, right? And that's totally fine. So on these kind of criticism where someone says, hey, this isn't for me, I'm not interested. Well, the answer is sure. That's totally fine, right? And if the criticism is, how does that work, or how does technology work, and so on. And so I think to a few of these points you have good answers, and to a few of these points you have the answer that, well, you don't know yet, right? And this is what the research is for about. And then maybe there's a smaller group, luckily, but again, we live in Berlin, which is a very liberal city, and they live in a relatively liberal country, right? So there are probably some people who say this is very immoral, and well, then we can have a conversation, right? And then my answer would be, okay, so what do you mean by immoral, right? So I think in general, we currently see significantly less criticism than we would have expected, right? We would have expected significantly more people being in one of these groups. It seems to me if you explain this way or this procedure and this value proposition in a tangible way and in a relatively scientific way, that a lot of people, at least they're fundamentally open to the idea. They're interested in the idea. They might not sign up tomorrow, or they might even say, hey, cool thing, but I don't care personally. And again, that's totally fine. But in the end, we don't see that much criticism. So I'm still waiting for some, priest who wants to have a panel discussion with me on stage or something like that, right? Or someone who wants to argue this is immoral. It doesn't need to be a priest, but anybody who wants to argue this is immoral, I'm more than happy to do so.
I mean, it's such a hard topic not to be just absolutely fascinated by. Like, right. Like I said at the beginning, it's one of these things that is, it's abundant in sci-fi, and it's just one of those things that is just such a cool thing to talk about. We actually have a comment from, or a question from the audience, and that is, what is the difference between cryopreservation and, say, an induced coma?
Right. So there are multiple steps, I think, where, on one hand you have full consciousness, and on the other hand you have cryopreservation, right? So apart from induced coma, there would also be what sometimes is called suspended animation, right? Which is sometimes discussed if you want to talk about space flight to Mars or farther away planets. So in induced coma, of course, is by all intents and purposes, you're still alive, right? So the body is still alive. Just your consciousness or your personal experience, just like anesthesia, is practically stopped, right? So your the cells still all do their thing, and your body works, and everything still is, the metabolic processes are still ongoing. So that I would say, so that's consciousness, like normal life here, and then induced coma is somewhere here, when cryopreservation is here on the other side. So induced coma is the body still lives, the cells do their thing, but your consciousness is stopped. Similar to anesthesia. And then you have what would be suspended animation, which would be, you cool your body, you reduce the metabolic activity, the metabolic rate, but fundamentally the metabolic rate is still ongoing, right? The metabolism is still ongoing. And why do you need to do this for spaceflight? Well, in spaceflight you have two problems, right? You need to bring water and food, and you need to bring oxygen. So if you reduce the metabolic rate, you need less oxygen and you need less food and water. So this is why they are interested in that technology of spaceflight, for not to go to the moon, but if you want to go to Mars or further, then at some point this makes sense. And then cryopreservation is way on the other side of the scale, where all the metabolic processes are stopped. So there is a fundamental, somehow you could argue they're on one scale, but there is a fundamental difference between cryopreservation and all the other things. And that point is metabolic processes are fully stopped.
Well, in that sense, wouldn't cryopreservation actually be favorable over suspended animation, as you only really need a source of liquid nitrogen, which does that have to be replenished every now and again, or is it?
Yeah, it does. No, it does. So you might think so, but so the problem is, if once you go, suspended animation is, you could argue that suspended animation already starts at 22 degrees, right? Like in a deep, like how animals hibernate almost, right? Their core temperature doesn't go down even close to zero. There are these frogs, like the green wood frog that actually goes pretty deep, because they have a natural cryoprotective agent in their bodies. So, but in general, you don't go through lower than freezing. So you have a whole new, plethora of problems once you go lower than zero. You need to do this for very, very, very long periods of time. But when we talk spaceflight, we talk currently, at least with technology that we currently have, we don't talk about multiple years or decades of going to planets or stars a few light years away, right? You talk about a couple of months, where you want to save maybe 50% of your oxygen, but you don't need these deep temperatures, and you would create more problems. And of course, currently it wouldn't even probably be possible to bring you back from these, from full cryopreservation.
So obviously the company works on the basis that there will be a day that comes where we can start reviving people. Now, my sort of next question is, have you made any plans for that day? When I was talking about this, I was talking about it with my family, that I was going to interview you, and we had a sort of great conversation about coming up with questions, and we sort of imagined the time when say a family got cryopreserved, and their grandchildren and their great grandchildren, and they were all woken up on the same day. I mean, that would be quite an extraordinary scenario. I was just wondering, have you sort of got a Tomorrow Biostasis party revival planned for that kind of thing?
Yeah, we didn't set a date yet, but so so yes and no. So on one hand, it doesn't make much sense to do any precise planning, also from a research side, right? Because it's just so far away that it's not like this field similar to the general longevity and life extension field is overflown with capital and resources and so on. So you need to pick your battles, what you want to do right now and what you can put off to the future, right? And of course, we decide that revival and planning for that, this is something we have time for and we can do in the future. But on the other hand, you need to do certain topics, or you need to take care of a few things because you can't do them in the future anymore, right? So for example, one point would be, so let's say someone dies right now and at the end of their life, they have, let's say, 5 million net worth or whatever. And, when they're being resuscitated, they might want to have a couple, they want to have a part of their assets in the future, right? I mean, of course, you can argue that maybe that future that's not relevant, but who knows, right? So, for example, one thing that we do have is we're setting up a structure which will be most likely a Liechtenstein-based foundation for long-term asset preservation, where people can put, let's say, at the end of their life, 50% goes to their family and their for inheritance, and 50% goes into that foundation, with the goal of it being returned in the future. So a couple of things you need to think about. Other things like, okay, so what would be the legal structure of that? How would that work in principle? These things, first of all, they're very difficult to answer right now, and you can't really do much about them.
I guess, yeah, it's one of those things that where if the technology does become available, then the law has to look at itself and take it into account. Because, I guess bringing people essentially back from the dead has huge repercussions in all sorts of law, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the closest thing is if people are being, after, let's say plane accidents or boat problems, where they're being, found after, let's say, I don't know, half a year or so, where they already have been legally pronounced dead. So in general, you can imagine that this process, it's not absolutely unimaginable how that would work, right? So either you just get your old passport back and you get a new passport number, or you get a new passport and you pick your name, right? So I mean, this is not a process. And of course, we had sometimes people ask, okay, so but would my social security then still pay for my retirement? And the answer, of course, to that is no, it wouldn't, right? So some things, I think to a few of these things, there are relatively simple questions, and you don't need to necessarily overcomplicate that process. But of course, currently there isn't really a legal framework for any of those things. Right? So this is definitely very far in the future.
Well, my final question, and I know it's a question that you're probably going to hate because you probably get asked all the time.
I don't mind.
And you've already sort of alluded to it, but what is your prediction for when we might have the technology?
Yeah, so again, this is pure speculation, right? So there's no good data, because I mean, in science, if process is linear, you can make good predictions, right? But usually, and especially for these kinds of topics, progress isn't linear, right? It's a step function, right? Where new technology comes about, and then we figure something out, and then suddenly we can do things that we wouldn't have imagined before, right? And it's not only about science; it can also be just about engineering, right? In these topics. Right, so in general, due to that, it makes it very, very difficult, because absolutely in that space here, progress is not linear by any means. It's very much a step function, and multiple steps are still required. So that part has a disclaimer. So on the lower bounds, I'm pretty confident that it won't be 10, 20, 30, 40 years, right? Somewhere between 50 and 100. And I'm saying that because this is kind of a time frame where I feel like all predictions just break apart. So basically, I'm picking a time frame where I could argue, well, it might as well be that one, right? Because no one could make the counter argument, right? Because again, also predicting for them would be the same problem. So I'm pretty confident that it's also not millions of years. It's probably also not thousands of years. But So my uneducated or slightly educated, but definitely not well-based prediction would be somewhere in the 50 to 100 plus years range. But I wouldn't. So for us, it's very important that if someone wants to sign up with us, that they're well aware of that point, right? We want to make it absolutely sure, because I think this is the only point where I mentioned before. I'm more than happy to argue, ethics about and morality of that topic. And I think the immoral point that you can create, and that's why we're very focused on not creating that one, is if you would sell this, try people or promote this by saying, 30 years, 40 years, whatever, it's 50 years. Don't worry about it, right? You just do cryopreservation and then in 50 years you'll live again. Where you would somehow allude to, or try to convince anybody that this is basically a safe bet. Mm-hmm. And it isn't. It's a bet, but it's not a safe bet. It's a bet that is probably way, or it's definitely higher than being cremated or buried. Right? There's no question there, at least in my mind. But what exactly the time frame is, I don't know. And I think this is it's very important to us that everybody who signs up with us knows about that, because I think this is where we would make an immoral. Or would be immoral if we wouldn't try to, or wouldn't make sure that this is absolutely clear.
Mm-hmm. Well, I did say that was a final question. We have had one more.
No worries.
That's all right. So it was just, so what are the 2 or 3 things that you intrinsically believe are inevitable regarding the future of longevity and or cryopreservation? And what are then the obstacles that may prevent these from happening?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if we can assume that we, within reason, understand how consciousness works, right? So if there's nothing that we will figure out in the future where something super weird, quantum or whatever, or metaphysical, putting that aside, if basically consciousness and all of that is a function of the structure of our brains, right? The connectome, and then all that stuff living significantly longer by orders of magnitude, that at some point that will be a thing, right? I don't know if there's, I'm not aware of any fundamental reason, and I'm also not aware of any good arguments that allude to a very fundamental reason that can never be avoided, that you shouldn't be able to just fix the body, practically speaking, indefinitely. Right? Take the car metaphor, where you just fix the car up, and then the car that usually was breaks down after 50 years can easily, or 15 years, can easily work for 150, right? So probably that's exactly the same with bodies, with humans, and same for cryopreservation, right? As long as we understand it, and as long as we keep the structure in a way where all the connectomes being kept, then, cryopreservation will also be reversible at some point. The only reason why I'm working for this and not for the longevity, but I think both topics are absolutely possible. And of course, the longevity and just taking your pills or treatment sector has the better value, at least on first sight, they have the better offer, right? Like ours has more, you go into cryopreservation and then maybe you're being revived. It sounds worse than just taking a pill. It's going to be more complex than a pill, but let's say kind of figure. The only disagreement I have is how much time that will take. Because the problem I think with longevity is, so we did an analysis a couple of months ago, where we looked at all the companies that claim to do anti-aging or longevity and life extension, and we looked at what they actually do, and then we took. So this was the first part of the analysis, and the problem in my mind is that a lot of people who sell themselves as longevity, they seem to do it for marketing reasons or fundraising reasons, and then they work on, I don't know, atherosclerosis in the leg or knee joint or whatever. Which of course, if you maybe you can repurpose that technology and so on and use it for something else. But then again, it seems to me, I don't know where this optimism comes from, and I'm more than happy to be proven wrong. But in general, if I would be a longevity company, I would also be very optimistic because I need to raise funds, right? So there's an inherent incentive to be a bit optimistic. optimistic. And the second point is we compared to startups that were founded at the same time that do cancer research or cancer drugs. And the cancer startups were 3x or something higher funded and had more people than the longevity and life extension startups. And I don't think they're all that much more intelligent, the people who go into longevity, right? The cancer people are also not stupid people, right? So the only disagreement we might have is about the time frame. Otherwise, I would do the longevity stuff. It's way better, and I'm very much counting on the whole longevity sector to make this happen as well, because of course the cryopreserved people are gonna need all that longevity and rejuvenation in the future as well. So.
Well, exactly. You sort of, I suppose, benefit by proxy.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Sort of
going well, but I mean, you need that point of view as well, because I completely agree with you in some sense. You know, a lot of these things can be talked up to the point where it can become realistic, and you know, all fields in science need that voice of reason sometimes, just to say, look, let's actually see what's going on here. But no, this has been absolutely brilliant talking to you. Really fascinating topic. An interview that I was really looking forward to, and
happy to be here. And I don't know if I answered the obstacle questions, but I'm not sure. Maybe really shortly, if it's a viewer question. So really shortly, so obstacle in their stake is, so there's a chance that technology will never work, right? So technologically. There's a chance that organizations don't have the longevity on an organizational side point where they might go out of business at some point. And of course, there's any amount of existential risks, right? So wars, asteroids, whatever you name it, and that might prevent the body which is cryopreserved to actually be kept in cryopreservation. So sorry for that. So all the longevity parts are all done by non-profit foundations in our case, to make sure that it's very stable and sound and so on. The storage that we do is underground, so that you can make sure that at least some existential threats are avoided. And of course, research we discussed a lot already. So research is what this organization is actually primarily about, to do research and then more research and more research and more research, to give at least this topic a good shot in the future. And I'm relatively, confident that at some point this will work.
Well, extremely well answered. And where can people sort of keep up to date with what you're doing and the news from Tomorrow Biostasis?
Right. So first of all, on tomorrowbiostasis.com, right? So sign up. We have multiple newsletters. We do webinars and all of that. We're organizing a large international scientific conference in October called Biostasis 2021. It's on biostasis2021.com, which will be in Zurich, where this whole topic and this whole community comes together. So if anybody is interested in that, we just went live with tickets a couple of days ago. And then in general, also, if someone is interested and wants to talk more about this topic, I'm more than happy, contact me on LinkedIn or on by email. I'm more than happy to talk and discuss further.
Brilliant. Well, I think we'll leave all the links. So
perfect.
Can find the relevant places as well. But thank you so much for giving us your time and for what was a really fascinating chat. So
thanks for having me.
Cheers. Well, thank you very much, guys. And if you want to check out more, go to the Gowing Life website, where you can check out all of our sort of news, updates, articles on longevity, health, and wellness. So thanks again for tuning in, and see you again next time.